You are an average Scandinavian of the Viking Age. Outside, it is November. Let's be blunt. The weather out there is the sort where a sensible master would not drive his dog out into the yard. Besides, your dogs are clever. They have long since come inside, like the rest of your family, your workers, and even your cows. Welcome home. We are used to thinking of Vikings as eternal wanderers, men who live aboard ships and survive on salty winds. The truth is that these hard people spent most of their lives not on raids, but within four walls. Or, more precisely, within walls that blend into the roof. Before you stands a langhus, a longhouse, the great architectural achievement of the North, unchanged for centuries. And believe me, this building can tell you more about Viking psychology than any battle axe. Come closer. The first thing that strikes the eye is its shape. If you look at the house from the side, you will notice a strange resemblance. The walls curve outward, the roof slopes, the ridge bows. Nothing comes to mind? It looks exactly like an inverted longship, a ship turned over. As if these people loved the sea so much that, when they came ashore, they simply flipped their boats and lived under them. It is a joke, of course, but the engineering logic is obvious. This shape stands up to the winds. And the winds in Scandinavia are such that a simple rectangular hut, the sort we are used to, would have been blown toward Iceland in a single night. Hi, I'm Daniel Hayes, and welcome to Lectures Under the Moon. The longhouse lives up to its name. Its length could reach 30 to 50 meters, and for the wealthiest earls, chieftains, as much as 80 meters. Think of a modern 20-story building, only laid on its side. And there you are, standing before a heavy oak door. Note that the door is the only opening in the wall at eye level. There are no windows at all. Glass was an absurdly expensive luxury, brought from the south, and nobody wanted to waste it on panes. Besides, a window is a hole that lets precious heat escape. So forget about airing the place. You push the door, it opens with a creak, and it nearly knocks you off your feet. No, it's not the host. It's the smell. A thick, compact cocktail you could cut with a knife. The scent of smoke, unwashed wool, old wood, food cooking, and dung. Yes, dung. More on that in a moment. You step inside, your eyes begin to sting, but you squint and try to take everything in. The first impression is that it's as dark as a cave. The only source of light is a long, open hearth that runs down the center of the packed earth floor. This is the heart of the house. The aren, the hearth, never goes out. If the fire dies, luck is gone. And with luck, the warmth will probably go too, which, with temperatures at -30 outside, is tantamount to a very sad ending. Around the hearth, life seethes. And when I say seethes, I mean an anthill. Imagine a modern studio apartment stretched out 50 meters in length. No walls, no partitions, no doors with plaques that say "Do not enter." Personal space. In that age, the idea did not exist. The very word private would have sounded to a Viking like an insult. Are you hiding something from your kin? Are you plotting mischief? In this great hall, 3, sometimes 4 generations live at once. Grandfathers and grandmothers who remember the days before the expeditions to England sit closest to the fire, warming old bones. Their sons with wives, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren crowd the space, and that is only the tip of the iceberg. "Helgi, move over, you've taken my log," the old man grumbles, trying to reclaim his place at the fire. "Father, you've been sitting there since dawn. Let me dry my boots," Helgi snaps, but still moves. This small quarrel is an ordinary evening scene, but the family is not everything. Along the walls, on raised platforms, sleep and live not only the masters, but their servants, slaves, thralls, and hired hands. Social distance here is measured not by walls, but by distance to the fire. The closer you are to the flame, the more important you are. The Jarl sits on his honored seat between carved posts, as close as possible to the hottest blaze, showing his status not by a crown, but by the simple fact that he does not have to chatter his teeth from the cold. Thralls huddle by the entrance, where drafts wander as freely as the wind across an open field. But come further into the house, where the darkness thickens. You hear odd sounds, heavy breathing, chewing, occasionally a lowing. No, that is not your uncle who overate at the feast. Those are cows. Yes, you heard correctly. In the cold months, livestock were often driven straight into the longhouse. Usually, the longhouse was divided into 3 main zones: living quarters, the storeroom, and the byre. There were no solid walls between them. At most, a light woven partition separated people from cows, goats, sheep. All of them were living heat sources. An animal gives off a great deal of heat, and the Vikings, being practical folk, made use of that. Why build a separate warm barn when you can settle the cow in the parlor? Of course, that added certain nuances to the atmosphere. The smell of dung mixed with the aroma of porridge, and flies, awakened by the warmth, buzzed everywhere, not caring who was slave and who was noble. But at least it was warm. In a world where a hard frost can send you to your ancestors in a single night, the choice between stench and freezing rarely went against the stench. Now lift your eyes. See that? The roof is supported by 2 rows of stout posts running the length of the house. The ceiling is high, yet you hardly see it for the smoke. Chimneys, in our sense, had not yet been invented. The smoke from the great central fire rises and gathers beneath the roof. Up there, at the very top, are small openings through which smoke ought in theory to escape. In practice, it worked like this. The smoke rose, struck the thatch or turf roof, and hung like a heavy blanket at head height. If you stood upright, you started to cough. So the Vikings at home often moved about slightly hunched, or else they sat more. The lower layer of air was relatively clean. The upper was unfit for breathing. "Close that hole already! Snow is falling straight into the cauldron," the housewife shouts, stirring the stew. "If I close it, we will all suffocate here, woman," her husband answers, coughing and rubbing his streaming eyes. It was the eternal dilemma of winter nights. Open the hole in the roof to let out the acrid smoke and admit the bitter cold, or close it, keep the heat, and turn the house into a smokehouse. Most often, a compromise was chosen. The Vikings lived in a state of constant mild oxygen hunger, and with constantly red eyes. Archaeologists studying the remains of people from that time often find traces of severe lung disease. Their lungs were black as miners, though they had never set foot in a mine. Their own comfort was undoing them. The floor underfoot was simply tamped earth. Sometimes it was strewn with fresh straw or reed to make it softer and warmer. But straw is a double-edged thing. On one hand, it insulates. On the other, it is a buffet for small creatures. Fleas, lice, and other joys of life treated the straw as their rightful kingdom. If you dropped a piece of bread on the floor, the 5-second rule did not apply here. What fell to the floor now belonged to the spirits of the underworld and the insects. The house walls were often boarded inside and covered outside with turf, chunks of earth with grass still growing on them. That made the house look like a little hill sprouting grass. In summer, goats grazed on the roof. Yes, literally. A goat on the roof was not a circus trick, but a familiar Scandinavian sight. Turf is a magnificent insulator. Walls could be about 1 meter thick. Inside such a house there reigned an eternal twilight and a peculiar sense of safety. The world outside, full of enemies, wolves, trolls, and icy winds, remained beyond the thick door. Here inside, there was a special space. Children were born here, sometimes literally a couple of meters from a chewing cow. Marriages were made here, legends told. The Longhouse was not merely a place to sleep, it was a fortress, a temple, and a workshop all at once. But the most interesting things began when night fell. When the sun, which in winter showed itself for only a few hours, finally sank below the horizon. The fire in the hearth was banked, but not fully extinguished. Shadows on the walls lengthened, becoming like monsters from fairy tales. The family prepared for sleep, and, believe me, to fit the faces of 50 relatives, slaves, and livestock on a single patch of floor for the night is a trial beside which steering a longship through a storm will seem child's play. Who lay by the wall? Who earned the privilege of sleeping nearer the fire? And how in Odin's name did they manage to get any rest beneath the snoring of Uncle Tarstein, who seemed able to outshout Thor's own thunder? The eyes grow used to the half-light, and now you begin to make out the details. Smoke from the hearth slouches lazily toward the hole in the roof. The cows in the far corner have at last stopped chewing and snuffle peacefully. The family is preparing for the most important ritual of the day, the turning in for the night. And here, at this very moment, social inequality shows itself more clearly than at any assembly. Tell me where you sleep, and I will tell you who you are. If you imagine that every Viking had a private bedroom with a door to slam in a fit of adolescent rebellion, you are deeply mistaken. The Longhouse is a space of total publicity. Yet, even in that tumult, an iron system of coordinates held sway. Look at the walls. Along both long walls run wide earthen or wooden platforms. These are the palli. By day they are benches for sitting, working, stitching sails, or mending nets. By night the palli become the house's principal sleeping artery. Think of it as an endless, open-plan sleeping carriage that goes nowhere, but snores with 100 voices. There is no male half and female half, as was often the custom in the East. Vikings slept mixed together, but strictly by rank. The most prestigious place is the center of the hall, opposite the main hearth. It is warmest there, it has the least smoke, and from there it is easiest to oversee the room or reach the pot of porridge. It is on that throne-like spot that the master of the house and his wife claimed their place. The rest of the household fans out from the center toward the ends. The farther from the center, the lower your status. The elder sons sleep closer to the father, younger children, distant relatives, and lodgers nearer the gable ends. There, at the very doors, where in winter an icy draught runs along the floor, capable of freezing water in a cup, sleep the slaves, the thralls. The thralls' fate at night was bleak. They had neither fur skins nor woolen blankets. Often their bedding was little more than a heap of old straw thrown on the earthen floor. Dogs were their only real warmth, and, if fortune smiled, a weather-beaten sheep pressed to their side. The thrall was a living shield against the cold, the first to meet the morning frost when the door was opened. If a thief tried to slip into the house at night, or, heaven forbid, an evil spirit, the one to encounter it first was the slave sleeping by the threshold. Such was the harsh guard system. But let us return to the elite. What did wealthy people sleep on? Archaeology has given us a rare window into the bedchamber of a noblewoman of the age. I mean the famous find at Oseberg. There, on a magnificent ship meant to carry 2 women into the afterlife, true beds were found, and they strikingly resemble modern furniture, only made with a meticulous attention to carving. Imagine a broad wooden frame with carved beast heads on the headboards. Those heads were not mere ornament. They likely frightened off night spirits. The bed's base was not solid, but slatted or woven so the mattress could breathe. Yes, they had mattresses. No springs, of course, but stuffed with hay, straw, or moss. And the ultimate luxury was the pillow. If you were a jarl, you did not lay your head on a log. You slept on a cushion filled with eider or goose down. That was a sign of extraordinary wealth. The down was collected by hand on sea cliffs at great risk of falling, so bedding and pillows were treasured like the apple of the eye. The sagas mention Vikings taking their own pillows along on voyages. Picture a brutal warrior with an axe in one hand and a down pillow in the other. Ridiculous? Not at all. A good night's sleep is the surest path to victory. Yet, if you look at these beds more closely, a surprise awaits. They are very short. A modern man of average height could not have stretched out full length on them. Were the Vikings dwarfs? Not at all. The analysis of their bones shows they were fairly tall fellows. After all, their diet was rich in protein. Two explanations have long circulated. The first is superstitious. It was believed that lying flat on your back with your legs outstretched was the posture of eternal rest. A living person should not sleep like that, lest the gods be confused. The second theory is medical and more pragmatic. Remember the smoke. In a longhouse, where a dense cloud hung beneath the rafters, to lie flat was to breathe deliberately the very thing that should have been escaping up the chimney. The half-upright position quite literally saved lives. It preserved the sleeping platforms and made breathing easier. Vikings slept propped on tall heaps of pillows, almost in the posture in which we nowadays watch series on the sofa. But what if you wanted not just to sleep, but to be alone? In the great hall, where 50 people snored, shifted, and let off winds, the notion of intimacy seemed fantastical. Yet Scandinavian cleverness found a way. Meet the bed cupboard, enclosed sleeping cabinet. An introvert's dream and a claustrophobe's nightmare. Or, put more plainly, a bed cupboard. It was a brilliant invention for the wealthiest houses. Imagine a large wooden cabinet with doors and, inside, a sleeping place. You climb in, close the shutters from within on a hook, and find yourself in your own tiny world. First, it is warm. The volume of air inside the cabinet is small, and 2 people can heat it in half an hour to tropical temperatures, even when outside it is 20 degrees below zero. Second, it is soundproof. Thick oak boards muffle the snores of Uncle Thorstein. Third, it is secure. If enemies burst into the house, you have an extra half-minute to wake, seize the sword that always hangs inside the cabinet, and meet unwelcome guests not in your underclothes, but fully armed. The bed cupboard, enclosed sleeping cabinet, was a fortress inside a fortress. Such beds were often built into the wall at the far end of the house. For children, they were the best place to play at spinning, and for adults the only way to be alone with a spouse. "You closed it, the bolt," the wife whispers in the dark of the cupboard. "Closed," answers the husband, and he wedges the axe. "Sleep peacefully." What of ordinary people who owned no carved beds or cupboards? They slept on those very benches and platforms. Bedding, forget crisp linen, Vikings slept on skins. Sheepskin was universal. By day it was a cloak, by night a mattress, by morning a prayer mat. They covered themselves with woolen blankets. Scandinavian wool is famed for its prickliness and water-repelling qualities. Such a blanket keeps you warm even when damp. But there is a drawback. Wool and skins are perfect homes for lice and fleas. The sagas are full of mentions of heroes scratching themselves. This was not considered shameful, it was part of everyday life. Before sleep, it was customary to search each other for pests. This grooming was a kind of social ritual, like that of primates, strengthening family bonds. Children had their own arrangements. Infants slept in suspended cradles, and that was no accident. The earthen floor was cold and draughty. A cradle hung from a beam sat in a warmer layer of air. Besides, if the cradle hung, it was harder for rats to reach it. In those days, rats felt as much at home in people's houses as any other resident. On especially cold nights, a communal sleep was sometimes practiced. The whole family would pile into a single big heap on every available hide. Children were placed in the center and adult men at the edges. Body warmth conserved itself best. In such a heap, social boundaries blurred. Only one task remained: to survive until dawn without freezing. Yet here is what is striking. Despite the closeness, the stink, and the insects, Vikings treated sleep with profound respect. Rudely waking a sleeper was considered bad manners and even dangerous. Why? Because a person's soul was thought to leave the body during sleep. If you shoved a sleeper, the soul might not return in time. The person would wake not wholly himself, might fall ill or lose his mind. They woke you gently, calling you by name and giving you time to come back. Imagine a huge bearded warrior whispering tenderly into another man's ear like a solicitous nanny. The contrast is almost comic. So, we have already sorted out where and on what everyone lay. The Jarl in his cupboard, his wife on pillows stuffed with down, the warrior on a bench, the thrall by the door on a bed of straw. All of them shut their eyes. But what happened next? When the last ember in the hearth went out, the house filled not only with snoring, but with the invisible presence of something else. Viking dreams were not merely pictures in the head, they were messages, prophecies, and encounters with those better left unseen. Night's atmosphere, however, was not only mysticism, it was also a catalogue of physical sensations. What does night smell like in an unventilated house? How does one breathe when the wet foot wraps of an entire war band are drying at your shoulder? We'll return to that sensory ordeal in the next chapter. You had taken your place according to the ticket you had purchased, that is to say, according to your social status. You wrapped yourself in a sheepskin, tucked a pillow or a log under your head, depending on your luck, and prepared to sink into the realm of sleep. Then you realize a simple truth. In the longhouse, sleep was not the mere switching off of consciousness. It was an active struggle against the environment. If we stepped into such a house today, the first thing we'd do is call the public health inspectors or the fire brigade, probably both. The atmosphere of a Viking night dwelling is a unique chemical cocktail that a modern person would be unlikely to endure without a respirator. Let us begin with what strikes you first: the smell. Forget lavender diffusers and a quick airing before bed. The air inside a Viking house was dense, heavy, and almost tangible. You could almost chew it. Its base note was, of course, smoke. As we have already established, there were no chimneys. Smoke from the hearth rose, cooled, and partially settled back down. By morning, everything inside, the walls, the beams, the clothing, your beard, and even the food in a bowl, was covered with a thin film of greasy soot. But smoke was only the beginning. Additives to that aroma came from 50 unwashed bodies. Yes, they bathed on Saturdays, but suppose tonight is Wednesday. Add in the scent of wet wool. There is rain and sleet outside, and dozens of cloaks are drying at the fire. Wool, as anyone knows, has a very particular smell. The final cherry on the cake was the animals. In the very same space, literally behind a flimsy partition, and sometimes without even that, stood cows, goats, and sheep. They chewed, they breathed, and, to put it plainly, they relieved themselves. The smell of dung was as integral to domestic comfort as the scent of morning coffee is to us today. If you lift your eyes toward the roof, you find yet another source of fragrance: the provisions. Vikings dried and cured fish and meat right in the house, over the hearth's smoke. Picture garlands of stockfish hanging there for 3 months. That odor permeated everything. Foreign travelers who entered Scandinavian houses often wrote that the Norse smelled of sour milk and old fish. It was true. "Bjorn, could you move your boots?" a woman might say. "They smell as if someone died in them last summer." "It is the smell of honest work, woman." "And they are not boots at all. They are cheese." This was not mere banter. It was everyday speech in a space saturated with these odors. Breathing gracefully in such a room was an art. At night, with the doors tightly closed, oxygen levels fell, while carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide rose. Vikings spent the whole winter living in a state of mild hypoxia. This induced headaches, lethargy, and possibly those vivid hallucinatory dreams that the sagas so often recount. Archaeologists call this condition anthracosis. The lungs of ancient people were black from soot on the inside, like those of heavy tobacco smokers, although tobacco had not yet reached Europe. Now consider temperature. The longhouse was governed by extremes. It was a zone of climatic madness. In the center, by the hearth where the master slept, it could be hot, sometimes excessively so. Sparks from the fire would readily burn a fine pelt, or drift into the beard of a sleeping man. Outside the glow of embers, the cold could be fierce, and the contrast between the scorching center and the freezing perimeters defined every movement, every choice of bedding, every placement of animals and people. Sleep, in short, was a negotiation with fire, smoke, bodies, and the constant bargaining of warmth and suffocation. Those who slept by the fire often woke because there was nothing to breathe from the heat and threw off their blanket. But step 3 meters toward the wall or the entrance, and you were in the Arctic. The walls, though lined with turf, still froze solid. Drafts ran across the floor as if they owned the place. In truth, they did. In the morning, for those who slept by the wall, rime could lie on the blanket, and the water in the bucket by the door would wear a crust of ice. A Viking's sleep was therefore a continual search for thermal balance. You stuck a foot out from under the hide, and your toes froze. You buried your head and almost choked on smoke and your neighbor's scent. It was a constant fidgeting, a wary turning and shifting to find the golden mean where you were not yet burning, but no longer freezing. Light, or the absence of it, was a separate matter entirely. Night in a Viking hall was not simply dark. It was a darkness you could touch. The hearth was put to sleep for the night, embers scraped into a pile and banked so they would smolder until morning without blazing. This was done to save wood and for safety. Darkness came instantly, and in that darkness, fears woke. The Viking world was populated with beings best avoided: trolls, elves, ancestor spirits. They tended to be active at night. Any creak of a beam, any rustle in the straw, might not be a passing mouse, but the footfall of a draugr, an uneasy dead thing. To push back that blackness, people used lamps. These were not beeswax candles that smelled like honey. No. They were shallow dishes filled with fish oil, scraps, or tallow, with a wick of moss or cloth plunged into the fat. Such lamps burned dimly, sputtered pitilessly, and stank. Imagine the smell of burning cod fat, that rancid, sickening reek mixed with smoke and manure to create that singular, unmistakable atmosphere of the age. The soundscape of night deserves its own mention. Silence never existed. Picture a rough symphony of snoring from a household of robust men and women. Someone moaned in sleep, someone muttered, someone coughed. There was the smoke, remember? On top of that came the animals, the cow's deep sigh, the sheep's bleat, the dog scratching behind its ear while thumping a paw on the floor. Outside, the wind howled, the frame beams creaked, the thatch rustled on the roof. In that roar, the notion of privacy vanished utterly. It was impossible to slip out unnoticed when you needed to. Every step across the squeaking plank or through moving straw was heard by the whole hall. "Who is there wandering?" the head of the household asks sleepily. "It is I, Sven. I am going to the wind," answers the shadow guiltily. "Take the spear. The wolves are howling," the voice advises matter-of-factly, and falls silent again. Yet the most terrifying thing in that atmosphere was not the smell or the noise. It was the closeness. You were never alone. Even in sleep you felt your brother's elbow, an uncle, or the warm breath of a favored hound. That constant elbowing brought intimacy to an absolute degree and shaped the Viking psyche. You were part of the clan. You were one with these people. Your heat was their heat, your sleep their sleep. For a Viking, solitude was not a blessing but a curse. To be left alone in the dark and cold meant certain doom. Thus, despite the smoke, the stench, and the crush, that crowded, smoky, foul-smelling house was the safest, most comforting place on earth. It was a little island of life amid an icy void. Lying there in the dark, listening to the clan's breathing, a Viking felt protected. The smoke burned the eyes, but it testified that the fire still burned. The animals' smell meant food awaited. The comrades' murmurs meant no enemy had come. Still, there was one delicate problem in this communal idyll. How, in such conditions, where every breath was heard at the other end of the hall, did people manage to continue with ordinary relations? How love one another, when on one side your father snores and on the other a goat chews? We will talk of that spicy side of domestic life, of inventiveness and silent agreements, in the next chapter. For now we come to the question that has likely been turning on your tongue since we stepped into that crowded, noisy, never-sleeping house. If there are no walls, no doors, and not a single square meter of privacy, where did the children come from? How, in a setting of total communal living, where every rustle carries for 30 meters, did people manage to build a private life? Let us be honest. To a modern person raised on the cult of privacy, Scandinavian household life would look like a nightmare on Eve. For us, a closed bedroom door is a sacred right. For a Viking, it was an unaffordable luxury. Yet humans are astonishingly adaptable. If you cannot build wooden walls, you build walls out of social rules. The principal secret keeper of Viking intimacy was the art of not seeing. Inside the longhouse, an unwritten but ironclad public contract governed behavior. If two grown people under the same blanket began to behave a little more actively than usual, or if they started whispering, the rest of the house instantly went blind and deaf. It was a collective game of I see nothing. To notice, to comment, or, God forbid, to make a joke about what was happening was the height of indecency. That could lead to a serious quarrel, and quarrels in a cramped house in winter were nobody's desire.
"Helga, do you hear? It seems Sven and Astrid are starting," whispers a young, inexperienced thrall. "Be quiet and eat your porridge," hisses the old, wise matron at him, not even turning her head. The rats rustle.
Just big rats, nothing more. The setting itself helped. Remember the dark. At night in the house you could hardly see your hand. Add to that the acoustic background. Snoring, coughs, the low breathing of animals. All that produced the white noise that hid anything excessive. Wool, hides, and thick blankets were excellent sound insulators, so technically the task of discretion was feasible. Still, where possible, couples sought seclusion outside the living area. Here the buyer came to the rescue. Yes, that very part of the house where the cows stood. In winter it might well be the most romantic place on the farm. It was warm, thanks to the animals. It smelled of hay and other things people eventually learned to accept. And above all, cows keep secrets better than people. "I must go check on the calf," was a classic euphemism everyone from the smallest child to the eldest understood. Summer made things easier. The Scandinavian landscape, though harsh, offered many options. Haystacks, granaries, boats moored at the shore, or simply a thick copse of trees. Those born in the spring, 9 months after the warm season, were called summer children. There were always more of them. Winter, by contrast, was a time that tested both affection and frost resistance. Intimacy was not only physics in motion, it was law as well. Here the Vikings can surprise us. We have been schooled to picture them as wild barbarians dragging women by the hair into caves. Discard that stereotype. A woman in the Viking Age held rights that her contemporaries in Christian Europe could only dream of. Marriage among Vikings was less a romantic union than a contractual deal between two clans. It was a serious, written agreement, sealed with property. The groom had to pay a bride price, the mundur. That was not a price tag, but a guarantee of earnest intent. Even more interesting was the morning gift. After the first marital night, the husband was obliged to present his wife with a gift the following morning. It could be anything: fine jewelry, a herd of cows, a plot of land, even an entire homestead. That present became her personal, inviolable property. Even if the marriage fell apart, and that happened often, the husband had no right to reclaim the morning gift. It was her insurance, her safety net. Now brace yourself. Divorce among the Vikings was commonplace, and a woman could initiate it. She did not need to petition a bishop or wait for a king's decree. The procedure was brilliantly simple. The woman summoned witnesses, neighbors or members of the household, stood by the marital bed, and loudly declared, "I divorce you. I divorce you. I divorce you." Then she repeated the same words at the threshold of the house. That was it. The marriage was dissolved. She gathered her belongings, took her morning gift, and rode off to her father's place. The grounds for divorce were written into the laws with pedantic precision, and some of them sound downright amusing to us. A woman could divorce her husband if he alone was unable to fulfill the conjugal duty for 3 years. 2, he had left the family without sustenance. 3, he had given her away 3 times. The law protected women from domestic violence. 4, and this is my favorite clause, he wore women's clothes. Yes, cross-dressing was a lawful reason for dissolving a marriage. What is more, the rule ran both ways. A husband could divorce his wife if she wore men's trousers. Gendered dress codes were enforced with a kind of legal severity. A Viking in a gown or a Valkyrie in breeches was scandal, shame, and division of property. "Torvald, is that my shirt?" The wife would squint suspiciously. "No, dear, I simply got them mixed up in the dark," came the reply. "Witnesses here." He has put on my linen undergarments again. When peace reigned in the household, however, the woman was the absolute mistress within the walls. While the husband was away on raids, which could last for years, or on trading voyages, the wife ran everything. She decided what to sow, when to slaughter the beast, how much grain to sell and how much to keep for the winter. Her authority had a physical emblem: keys. The mistress of the house, Husfreya, always wore at her belt a bundle of bronze keys, keys to pantries, to chests of valuables, to storehouses. This was not mere ornament. It was a badge of status. Their jingle while she walked was music of command. Do you hear the keys? Then the mistress is coming. You would do well not to stand in her way. Handing the keys to another woman was to renounce authority by choice. Even in death, women were often buried with their keys, as if setting out to put the house of the goddess Freya in order. Intimacy among the Norse lacked the overlay of sin and shame that Christianity would later impose. Sexual closeness was treated as plainly as food or sleep, a natural need that brought pleasure and continued the line. In the sagas, the gods love, cheat, grow jealous, and sire children with enviable regularity, and mortals only mirror the divine appetites. Living at such close quarters bred its dramas. Jealousy behind curtain and timber could be a terrible force. The sagas are full of love triangles that end in duels. Duels, formal single combat, or long-lasting family feuds. If you wink at your neighbor's wife, be ready to explain yourself to her husband tomorrow, with an axe in hand. Secrets in the Longhouse did not stay secret for long. But let us return to our night. Suppose all rituals were observed, no one had worn another's trousers, and everyone slept peacefully. Morning arrives. The first sensation of a waking Viking is savage hunger. A body that has spent vast calories keeping warm in a cold house demands fuel, and not a light snack, but something substantial, hot and filling. What did they eat to find the strength to lift a heavy sword, or to row a longship all day? Forget smoothies and avocado toast. We are heading to an Iron Age kitchen, where porridge rules, and, when fortune allows, meat follows. Welcome to the hearth. By hearth, I mean that same space around the fire where we had just slept, scratched ourselves, and contemplated divorce. Now a different work begins. Women coax the embers back to life, and through the heavy breath of last night, the rescuing scent of hot food finally breaks. Let us set straight a Hollywood myth. Films show Vikings perpetually gnawing roasted boars, grease artistically dripping down their beards. If they had eaten like that, by 30 they would have been crippled with gout and fat, unable to climb into a longship without overturning it. Reality was more prosaic and healthier. The backbone of a hard northern warrior's diet was what the fashionable cafes today hawk as superfood: grain. Porridge was the alpha and omega of the Scandinavian table. Everyone ate it, from the high king to the lowest thrall. The difference lay in the ingredients. In the pot of a well-to-do house, one would find barley boiled with butter and pieces of meat or dried fruit. In poorer households, the porridge might be thinner, but it still did the crucial work of filling bellies and fueling limbs. In the poor man's cauldron, oats bubbled in water, sometimes seasoned with a pinch of salt if luck held. Salt was expensive. The Vikings understood slow carbohydrates 1,000 years before dietitians. Porridge provided energy that was released slowly, letting a man swing an axe or cut hay for hours without hunger. Their eating schedule was strict and ascetic. No snacking, no afternoon teas, no midnight nibbling. They ate only twice a day. The first meal, dagmal, was breakfast, coming roughly a couple of hours after sunrise, around 8 or 9 in the morning. Yes, they rose with the dawn, worked on an empty stomach, and only then sat down to eat. Usually it was yesterday's reheated pottage or fresh porridge with bread. The second and final meal, nattmahl, was the evening meal. It took place at the end of the workday, between 7 and 8 in the evening. That was when something more substantial might be served, boiled meat or fish. "Mum, barley porridge again?" the little Viking whines. "Eat in silence, Thorsten. Your father took Paris on that porridge, and you shall eat," the mother answers sternly, ladling sour milk into the bowl. Speaking of milk, Scandinavia was a realm of dairy. Cows, sheep, and goats were the principal keepers of life, yet fresh milk was rarely drunk plain. Without refrigerators, it soured quickly, so the Vikings became masters of fermentation. Their chief culinary invention was skyr. It is somewhere between thick yogurt and soft curd cheese, tangy, dense, and ridiculously high in protein. Skyr could be stored in barrels for months. They ate it plain, spread it on bread, or thinned it with water as a drink. Archaeologists find barrels of skyr on sunken ships and in settlements. It was the Iron Age protein shake. They also adored butter. Butter was not merely food, it was currency. In Iceland, for example, taxes could be paid in butter. Good manners meant serving food literally swimming in butter. There was even a saying, "Porridge without butter is like a longship without wind." Salted butter was preserved so well that it could keep for years without going rancid. Now about bread. Forget soft, fluffy rolls. Viking bread was flab. Flat, hard cakes made from barley or rye flour, baked on stones by the hearth or in pans. They were so tough they acted like sandpaper for the teeth. Examining Viking skulls, researchers see the same picture again and again. Worn teeth, but almost no cavities. Why? Because their diet contained no sugar. Honey was an expensive delicacy, and the hard bread mechanically scraped away any plaque. Occasionally, a stone chip from the quern would find its way into the flour and claim a tooth. There were no dental clinics, sadly, and the best anesthesia was strong ale and grit of spirit, so teeth were guarded like the greatest of treasures. And where was the meat? Where were the mountains of game? There was meat, but not every day. Mostly people ate animals that could no longer give milk or wool. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs. Hunting moose or deer was more of a noble pastime, or a necessity in truly hungry years, not the primary source of food. And meat was almost never roasted. To roast meat over an open fire was wasteful. Fat dripped into the flames and was lost. Fat is energy. So meat was boiled. Boiled for a long time in enormous cauldrons, with vegetables, herbs, and grain. The result was a thick stew called sod. That dish remains popular in Norway today. The cauldron of stew was often not washed. New ingredients were simply added as old ones were eaten. An eternal pot whose flavor shifted from day to day. The main problem was not cooking, but storage. How do you keep a ton of meat after you slaughtered stock in the autumn because you had nothing to feed them over winter and yet wanted to eat until spring? Nature served as the refrigerator, but that was not enough. Salt was imported and expensive, so they economized and used methods that would make a modern health inspector faint. Drying was paramount, especially of fish. Cod, the famed stockfish. Fish were caught, gutted, and hung on wooden frames in the icy wind to dry. It dried until it was like wood. In that state, it could be kept for years. Before eating, it had to be beaten with a hammer for an hour to soften it, and then simmered for a long time. It was the perfect ship's ration for long voyages, light, nutritious, and everlasting. Smoking. The smoke in the house not only stung the eyes, it also preserved meat hung from the rafters, and, of course, the pickling in whey. Meat was packed into barrels and covered with sour, lactic whey. The acid killed the bacteria of spoilage. The flavor of that meat was distinctive, sour, sharp, but there was no choice. What about vegetables? The Vikings did not suffer from scurvy, as sailors of the age of Columbus did, because they knew the secret. Cabbage, onion, lots of onion, peas, turnips, and, of course, angelica. They ate the plant whole. The stalks were like celery, the roots used as seasoning. Onion soup made with milk was a staple that sent neighbors on the opposite sleeping benches in the longhouse sliding a little farther away. There is an interesting legend about how the Vikings checked the severity of a wound. They gave the injured man a very pungent onion broth. If, after a while, that smell could be detected coming from the wound, then the entrails were hit, and miraculous healing was already impossible. Harsh, but effective field diagnosis. And what did they wash down all this magnificence with? Water was a risky choice. Drawing from a stream upstream risked whatever waste someone might have dumped into it, and could bring a stomach disorder that, on campaign, might prove fatal. So they drank what had been fermented. A weak ale, a beer brewed by the women. It was a household drink, for the whole family, children included. The alcohol there was laughably low, a couple of % at most, but it was enough to render water safer. Beer was thick, nourishing, and served warm. Cold beer in a cold house was a dubious pleasure. Honey and mead were another matter. Elite alcohol, the drink of gods, of poets and of kings. Sweet, strong, staggering. It was consumed from horn cups, and drinking from a horn is not merely handsome, it is inconvenient. You cannot set the horn down until you have drained it to the bottom. A splendid way to make guests liven up more quickly. There was, however, a time of year everyone feared above all else: the spring hunger. In March and April, the old stores ran low. Barrels of skyr were empty, the dried fish had been eaten. Only seed grain remained, and that could not be touched under threat of exile, for otherwise there would be nothing to reap in the autumn. People turned to foraging. They ate bark, moss, dug up roots, boiled leathery straps and old shoes. It was that spring famine that drove the Vikings to raiding. Often the longships put to sea not for gold, but for food. English monasteries, with their full barns, were for northerners less religious sites than gigantic supermarkets where one could shop without queuing. The psychology of the feast was born from this cycle of hunger. If there is food, eat while you can. Fill your belly, for tomorrow there may be none. The ability to eat and to drink much was considered a virtue equal to skill with the sword. A good warrior was a well-fed warrior. Evening comes. Dinner has been eaten, porridge scraped from the kettle with wooden spoons. By the way, everyone carried their own spoon in a little pouch at the belt, a personal utensil. Bellies full, warmth spreading through the body. And then, when the brain, stupefied by satiety and the weak ale, begins to relax, the time for the main entertainment arrives. The Vikings did not go straight to bed after eating. The feast, ceremonial drinking gathering, began. The time of the cup and of speech. After all, stuffing the stomach is only half the task. You must also feed the soul with stories, boastings, and promises that will have to be kept in the morning. But how the Vikings drank, how they kept their wits or lost touch with reality, and what mad vows they swore over the cup of mead, fermented honey drink, we will speak of in the next chapter. So the kettles are scraped, the mutton boiled, and the stomachs are full. The fire in the longhouse hearth snaps a little cheerfully, shadows in the corners thicken, and a peculiar tension hangs in the air. This is not the silence that precedes sleep. It is the lull before the storm. The feast, ceremonial drinking gathering, begins. This was a time when ale flowed like a river, and words were sharper than swords. If you think a Scandinavian feast is simply a chaotic meal where everyone shouts and face plants into the salad, you are underestimating these people. The feast was a finely tuned social mechanism. It mixed diplomatic reception with stand-up and with a courtroom proceeding. All of it carried a high probability of accidental injury in the middle of the fun. The chief performer at such an event was the mistress of the house. It was the woman, the husfreyja, who carried the first horn. She handed it to the most honored guest or to her husband. That gesture carried colossal importance. In a world where any cup might contain unwanted additives or simply bad ale, receiving a drink from the hostess meant, "You are safe. We honor you." Drinks were sorted by class. For opening the evening, they served a thick, dark, bread-like ale. It was drunk by the liter like water. But the sovereign of the night was mead. Not the spoonful you stir into tea, but the fermented, heady drink that could fell even berserkers. Mead was costly. To fill a single keg required tribute from hundreds of beehives. Drinking mead was a public display of wealth and power. And here we come to the gadget of the party, the horn. Why a horn? Could they not make a clay cup or carve one from wood? They could and did, but at the feasts people drank from the horns of bulls or aurochs. The horn has one sly, even malicious feature. You cannot put it on the table without spilling its contents. It has no flat base. If someone pours for you, must either hold that horn in your hand all evening, which is awkward when you wish to gesture, or you must drain it in a single motion and then overturn it. It was a brilliant way to accelerate the effect of the drink upon the guests. Sven, why are you sitting with a full horn? Do you not respect the host? I do respect him. I'm just trying to remember where I live. Drink. Or do you want to offend the spirits of our house? Refusing a drink was read not as concern for one's health, but as a challenge. If you would not drink, you were keeping a clear head. Why keep a clear head among merry friends? Are you plotting something? Are you a spy? The drinking ritual moved the horn from hand to hand. That, too, was a test of trust. You drank from the same vessel as your neighbor. You touched the same rim with your lips. At a time when hygiene was not the highest priority, this bound people together more strongly than any written agreement. The first toasts were always for the gods. First for Odin, that he grant success, then for Njord and Freyr, that the crops may grow and ships not founder. Afterwards, people toasted the king, their ancestors, those present, those absent. By the middle of the night, the reason for another drink could be simply that there was liquid left in the horn. And when tongues loosened, the most interesting part began. Ritual boasting, public boast contest. Ritual tailing, the public display of boastful praise. A Viking could not sit modestly in a corner. He had to make himself known. Warriors would stand upon benches and begin to list their exploits. I, Ragnar, son of Ragnar, have crossed 3 seas, defeated 5 opponents with one hand, and took this brooch from the king of the Franks himself. It reads like braggadocio, and it was. But there was a catch. Everything uttered at the feast was taken as sacred truth. If you lied, and it came to light, your authority would collapse below sea level. Some men bragged loudly, but they tried not to overreach. After boasting came the vows, the oath-binding. Imagine you are already very unsteady on your feet. The sea is at your knees, and they bring out the brag cup. You lay your hand on the sacred boar. Yes, they often dragged a sacrificial animal in for the rite. Or else you put your hand upon the hilt of your sword, and you loudly promise to do something incredible. I swear that I will not cut my hair until I conquer England. Or, I swear that next winter I will marry the king's daughter. The next morning, when your head feels as if it is splitting, many Vikings recalled these promises with horror. But a word given over the cup could not be taken back. Breaking an oath was more dreadful than losing a duel. It was a loss of honor. Daniel Hayes, Lectures Under the Moon. Many great raids and utterly mad adventures began just like that, with a round of mead and tongues that ran too long. But if everyone loves and flatters one another, it gets boring. So the Vikings invented flighting, an old rap battle. Two warriors stood opposite one another and began to spray the rival with exquisite barbs. Yet this was not mere name-calling, it was poetry. You had to humiliate your opponent in verse, keeping to the meter and alliteration. Your sword is as dull as your jokes, and your courage fled before you even saw your enemy. Your voice is creaky like an old cart, and you smell as if you slept in an embrace with a troll. The hall roared with laughter. Judges scored the wit. The loser had to drink a forfeit horn, which, in practice, was a prize in itself. Flighting was a way to let off steam. Better to put everything you think of your neighbor into rhyme than to reach silently for your weapon. It was Iron Age group therapy. Drinks are drinks, though. At a certain point, the revelry slid into a phase of gravitational anomaly. Vikings knew their limit, and often ignored it. In the Havamal, the compendium of practical wisdom attributed to Odin, there is plenty of advice on this topic. Least useful to a man is what is called ale. The more you drink, the less you think. Odin would not offer bad counsel, but who listens to wise advice at 3 o'clock in the morning? What happened when the feast ended? Those who could still walk drifted back to their benches. Those who lost the battle with the green serpent slept where they fell. The floor of the longhouse, strewn with straw, became a single, enormous mattress. Here, the guest code came into force. A sleeping person on the floor might not be touched, even if he was your sworn enemy, the very man with whom you had just traded barbs. While he sleeps in your house, even face down in a bowl of leftover horn, he is untouchable. To break the law of hospitality was to invite the wrath of the gods and the scorn of men. If you're enjoying this, please like the video and subscribe to Lectures Under the Moon. People slept where they lay. The smell of ale mixed with smoke, creating precisely that atmosphere everyone cursed in the morning. Then morning arrived. A Viking hangover was an epic state. In the sagas, it is called the wooden people, timmermen. The term is later, but it conveys the meaning. When carpenters hammer in your head, it rings like a church bell. In the mouth, one conditionally survives with dry moss, and the body aches from sleeping on a hard floor in a pose like a broken rune. How did they cure it? Pickle? Aspirin? No, only hardcore remedies. The most popular cure was like with like. A morning cup of weak ale was considered the best medicine. It returned the body to its accustomed balance. A second method was physical exertion. Nothing clears the mind like chopping wood in the frost or rowing hard. The third method was the bath, but more on that later. There were more exotic recipes too. For example, eat a fledgling swallow turned to charcoal and mixed with water, or chew certain herbs. Frankly, the effectiveness of those measures is doubtful. The hangover also had a social function. It was a time of collective contrition. In the morning, sitting with bleary eyes around the cooling hearth, warriors tried to reconstruct the night. I really promised to give you my best cow. Really? And I swore by Thor's hammer. Oh, well, word is word. Take it. It is at moments like that that true friendship was forged. Surviving a battle together is one thing. Surviving the shame of last night together binds you for life. There was a darker side. Sometimes, when reason clouded too much, old grievances resurfaced, and the guest code cracked down the seams. The fire trap was a harsh but effective dispute resolution tactic. If negotiations reached an impasse, the host could simply step outside, lock the door from the outside, and use fire as the final argument. Guests, weary from the feast, often did not react in time. History knows many a konung who ended his journey precisely like that, on a floor that did not go as planned. For that reason, a prudent Viking, even in the deepest repose, slept with his weapon at hand. Daniel Hayes, Lectures Under the Moon. They did not lay the sword under the pillow. They tied it to the wrist or left it within reach so it could be seized in a fraction of a second. The shield hung above the head. Sleep was thin. Any suspicious smell, any metallic clatter, snapped them from log-like stillness into a state of battle readiness. But imagine that everything had gone well. No quarrels. Oaths made. Ale drunk. A new day breaks. It is Saturday, Laugarth. You wake up feeling, to put it mildly, far from fresh. Your clothes are saturated with smoke and sweat, with spilled mead and the scent of the dog you slept against. Your hair is tangled into mats, crumbs of bread cling in your beard. You look at your hands and know you cannot go on like this. It is time to wash away the week and the consequences of last night's revelry. It is time to do what shocked fastidious Englishmen who washed once a year. The Vikings go to the bath. And believe me, a bathing day in the north is not mere hygiene. It is almost a religion. The morning after a feast is a heavy hour. The head throbs, the mouth is parched, and the smell in the longhouse is such that one could hang an axe on it. If you suppose a Viking waking in that state merely shook himself, scratched his ribs, and went back to raiding, you are deeply mistaken. It was at this moment, on Saturday morning, that the miracle happened that confounded medieval chroniclers. The Vikings went to wash. Pause for a second to take in the scale of that statement. Early medieval Europe, put mildly, did not smell of roses. Christian saints often boasted that they never washed their bodies, treating filth as a sign of sanctity and renunciation of earthly pleasures. Kings bathed twice in their lives, and once not by choice. Yet here, on the wild northern fringe, lived pagans who had turned personal cleanliness into a cult. The very word for Saturday in Scandinavian tongues, Laugarthr, literally means bathing day or washing day. Not a day of rest, not a day of prayer, but the day when we finally wash ourselves clean. It was a weekly compulsory ritual, programmed into the cultural code as strictly as the ability to hold a shield. Sven, where are you going with that Venik? We've been worse attacked. Today is Saturday. If I do not wash, my wife will not let me go to the stall. A Scandinavian bath was not a Roman thermae of marble and mosaic. It was starkly functional. Typically, it was a separate small structure, often half sunk into the earth, with a heap of stones piled at its center. The stones were heated until they glowed, then water was thrown over them. Familiar, isn't it? The sauna principle had not changed in 1,000 years. In that steam, amid thick plumes, hard men beat one another with birch or juniper venics. It was not masochism. It was deep exfoliation and massage in a single motion. Steamed skin cleaned more easily, and the blows of branches stirred the blood, helping to chase away the effects of yesterday's ale. Instead of soap, which existed but was costly, they used lye, an infusion of wood ash. It bites the eyes and stings, but it cleans everything, sins included. Yet the bath was only the tip of the iceberg. If you peer into the grave of a noble, and often of a common Viking as well, you will find among the sword and axe items you least expect. Combs. Thousands, tens of thousands of combs, carved from deer or elk antler, worked with intricate patterns and housed in fitted cases, turn up under archaeological trowels more often than weapons. A comb for a Viking was a first necessity. Lose a sword and you might be shamed. Lose a comb and it was a catastrophe. How would you face other people? Vikings groomed themselves every day, and they did not merely smooth flyaway hairs. They arranged those long locks with care. Long hair signaled free will and strength. Slaves were cropped or shaved bald so lice might take hold. A free man wore a mane, and that mane had to shine. Beard care was a whole other song. The beard was a man's passport. It was braided, oiled, adorned with rings. To cut or burn a man's beard in a fight, or worse, to lop it off while he slept, was an insult that could be washed away only in single combat. Besides razors, a Viking's wash kit could contain tweezers. Yes, they plucked stray hairs. Toothpicks and, pay attention, ear spoons. Small, delicate little scoops of bronze or silver for cleaning the ear. Picture Ragnar Lothbrok, terror of the seas, sitting on the stern of a longship and thoughtfully picking at his ear with a silver spoon. The image seems odd, and yet it is unfairly mocked. Clean ears were the guarantee that you would hear an enemy creeping up on you. But the most important beauty secret of the North was bleaching. The ideal of beauty there was blonde. Light hair was associated with gold, the sun, nobility. Genetics, however, can be capricious, and not everyone was born with golden hair. What to do? For a dark-haired man who wanted to be fashionable, chemistry. They used an incredibly caustic soap, high in lye, to lighten hair. That soap not only made every insect capitulate, lice literally packed their bags and rode off into the sunset at the sight of it, but it also burned out pigment. Historians write that many Vikings had hair unnaturally white or reddish precisely because of these procedures. Now imagine the scene through the eyes of a 10th century English monk. John of Ulfingford wrote bitterly and with no small envy, "These pagans, because of their habit of combing their hair every day, bathing every Saturday, and often changing their clothes, have won into their hearts the married women and even the noble daughters of our lords." Do you see the irony? The English viewed the Vikings as a threat not only because they wielded axes well, but because they were excessively attractive. They were clean. To a local lady whose husband had last washed himself at his coronation, the northerner, smelling of soap and juniper, with a well-kept beard, was simply irresistible. Vikings literally won wives from the Anglo-Saxons with a comb and a bath. It was their secret biological weapon. Of course, there were exceptions. Some men took vows to neither wash nor cut their hair until they had restored a father's honor. Harold the Shaggy, the unifier of Norway, walked for 10 years, wild and dirty, until he had conquered the whole country. For that, he was called Harold the Shaggy. Only after his victory did he go to the bath. It was probably the longest bath in history. He had his hair cut, he combed it, and at once became fair-haired again, marketing worthy of a god. Friends, a small request. Support Lectures Under the Moon with a like. It helps the channel grow. Washing clothing was also part of the Saturday ritual. In cold mountain streams, using that same lye or urine. Yes, old urine, allowed to stand for a couple of weeks, turns into ammonia, an excellent bleaching agent. The smell, of course, was peculiar, but stains from riotous feasts and grease vanished under it. Afterwards, the garments were rinsed thoroughly and dried on the wind to air out the scent of cleanliness. Speaking of cold water, Vikings practiced a hardening that would make a modern walrus's heart stop. Newborn children were plunged into snow or icy water to test their strength and fortify their immunity. Those who endured, fortunately many did, grew into people for whom plus 5 degrees Celsius felt like heat, and minus 10 degrees Celsius a light chill. Morning washing was obligatory. In the words of the High One, it is said, "Wash yourself with water before the feast, and dry yourself with a towel." Their towels, of course, were not fluffy terry, but coarse linen. They did the job. In every house, a basin of water stood by the entrance so that a guest could wash his hands. It was a sign of respect both to the household and to the spirits. But back to the bath. After the body was steamed, scraped, and washed, after the hair was set and the beard combed, the moment of metamorphosis arrived. A Viking emerged from the steam, not merely clean, but renewed. Dirt, soot, the odours of long journeys, figuratively speaking, the smells of smoke and dung, were left in the roadside gutter. A man felt himself human again, not a woodland beast. And now, when the body shone and the skin squeaked, the crucial question remained: what to wear? Surely these dandies, who spent hours grooming their beards, simply pulled on shapeless sacks? Oh no, a Viking's wardrobe was a riot of color. Silk from Byzantium, piles of fur, and trousers so deftly cut that modern designers would gnash their teeth with envy. We have become used to seeing them in films swaddled in gray-brown rags. That is a lie. The Viking world was colorful, bright, and ostentatiously expensive. In the next chapter, we will pry open their chests and learn why a Viking would sooner sell his soul than wear trousers without pockets. Joke. There were no pockets then. But there were things far cooler. Get ready for the fashion verdict of the century. You stand in the middle of the longhouse, clean, steamed from the bath, and you smell not of smoke and goat, but of ash and juniper. The feeling, one must admit, is royal. But one cannot stand like that for long. Drafts in Scandinavia show no mercy. It is time to dress. And here we arrive at a point that will shatter another popular myth. If you picture a Viking as a ragged brute wrapped in dirty gray pelts, fur on the outside, you are not looking at a historical person, but at an extra from low-budget fantasy. The real Viking was a serious dandy. Let us peer into their chests. The first thing that strikes the eye is color. The Viking world was not gray-brown. It was provocatively bright. They loved hues we would now call eye-wateringly vivid: red, yellow, blue, green. The brighter your clothing, the richer you were. Dyes then cost a fortune, and walking around in undyed wool the color of a terrified sheep was the fate of the poor and enslaved. "Torvald, have you seen the Earl's cloak? Blue as the sea before a storm." "Yes, they say he gave 3 slaves and a horse for that color." What a dandy. Blue was the most costly and prestigious tint. To get a rich blue, You needed woad or indigo brought from the east. So when a man approached in a brilliant blue tunic, you bowed to him before you saw his face. Reds came from madder, yellows from onion skins or certain mosses. At a feast, a Viking could look like a parrot blown off course into the tundra, and he was proud of it. The backbone of the wardrobe was vadmal. This dense, homespun woolen cloth was not merely a material, it functioned as currency. In Iceland there existed a standard vadmal el that could be used to pay for a mug of ale, for a sword, or for a fine at the thing. Imagine walking into a shop and paying with a roll of cloth. Convenient? Not especially, but dependable. Wearing wool next to bare skin is a trial for the faint of heart. It prickles, rubs, and bites. Therefore, the hero of the Scandinavian outfit was linen. The undershirt and shifts were sewn from linen. Linen grows poorly in Scandinavia, so it was frequently imported. A snow-white, or at least pale gray linen shirt peeking from beneath a woolen tunic said that its owner had money and taste. Now for the most intriguing piece. Trousers. Archaeology has given us several cuts, and they are astonishingly varied. There were tight, clingy trousers, reminiscent of modern skinny pants or leggings. These were tucked into socks or wound up the shins with long woolen bands, wraps. Practical. Nothing snags on a forest bush. But there were other trousers that sent Eastern travelers spinning their fingers at their temples. Wide trews, huge, voluminous pants with yards of fabric gathered and draped. These were called pants from Gardariki, that is, from Rus. The Vikings borrowed this fashion from the East and brought it home. The point of such trousers was purely ostentation. Look how much fabric I have. I can afford to drape my legs in 10 meters of wool, and I do not care. Walking in them was probably about as comfortable as moving in a sail, but fashion demands sacrifices. There were no pockets at all on trousers or tunics. Where did they put their gadgets? Knife, spoon, comb, purse with silver, flint? Everything hung on the belt. A Viking's belt resembled a modern load-bearing belt worn by special forces troops or construction riggers. I carry everything with me, and everything clatters as I walk. Female fashion was no less interesting. The base garment was a long linen dress, layered over with a hanger-rock or an apron dress with shoulder straps. Those shoulder straps were fastened across the chest with 2 heavy oval brooches, like tortoise shells. Between the brooches there often hung strands of beads made from glass, amber, or semi-precious stones. A Viking woman wore a small fortune on her body. The beads were not merely decoration, they were a bank account. In a pinch, a bead could be plucked off and traded for food. Night comes. The feast is over, guests disperse or collapse, and it is time to prepare for sleep. What did these lovers of bright tunics and wide trousers sleep in? Was there a Viking pajama with reindeer on it? The answer may surprise you. Most Vikings slept in absolutely nothing. Nakedness under the blanket was the norm, and there are perfectly logical reasons for this. Reasons tied not to licentiousness, but to hygiene and thermal regulation. First, clothing is expensive. If you tumble about in your best tunic on straw every night, it will wear through in a month, and to make a new one is 6 months' work at the loom. Second, insects, fleas, and lice love to hide in the seams of garments. By taking clothes off at night and hanging them out into the cold or above the smoke of the hearth, you give the parasites a clear message. You are not welcome here. Sleeping naked means sleeping more peacefully. Third, warmth. Oddly enough, under a thick fur skin, it is warmer to sleep without clothes. The layer of air between skin and fur works like a thermos. Put on clothes under the fur and they can soak with sweat. Then you will freeze. Of course, this was not an iron rule. The poor, who lacked enough warm pelts, slept in the clothes they had, simply pulling whatever they found over themselves. The old and the sick might keep their linen shirts on. The sagas mention nightshirts, but that was more an exception for the nobility. If you were a konungur, and uninvited guests with sharp weapons might burst in at night, meeting them stark naked was not exactly dignified, although the berserkers would have disputed that. To go into battle naked was considered the highest display of fearlessness and madness. But that is another story. So, you undress or remain in a linen shift. You fold your precious blue trousers neatly into the chest so the mice will not eat them, and you slip into bed. What is at your side? If you are wealthy, a down feather bed, soft, warm, divine. If you are an ordinary person, skins, sheep, goat, bear. Fur is the northerner's best friend. It warms you. It is soft. It smells of the animal. To sleep on a skin is to sleep hugging a very large, very tame bear. You cover yourselves with woolen blankets. Scandinavian weavers made special shaggy blankets that resembled artificial fur. Strands of uncarded wool were woven into the fabric. Such a blanket was heavy, windproof, and water-repellent. But there was one problem. Wool pricks. Imagine you lie naked, a base layer beneath that may be somewhat coarse, and above you a woolen blanket that nips at your shoulders, at your back, everywhere. Linen saved the day if you slept in a shirt. If not, your skin over time became as tough as a boot sole. There were also sleeping bags. Yes, the Vikings used prototypes of sleeping bags, especially on campaign. These were skins sewn together into a sack which you entered feet first. A leather bag was indispensable on a ship or in the woods. By day, you packed your things into it. By night, you packed yourself in. Helgi, you climbed into my bag. Sorry, in the dark all bags look the same. And besides, it is warmer here. Sleeping together under one hide was common practice, not only for spouses, but also for warrior friends. The warmth of human bodies is the most efficient heater. Nobody saw anything shameful in it. It was survival. A friend is known in trouble, the ancients said. In the north, one might say, a friend is known in the cold. If you were willing to share the heat of your back with a comrade, then he was someone you could take on a scouting mission. At last, everyone lay down. Clothes in the chests, swords by the head, heels tucked into fur. Warmth slowly gathered beneath the blankets. The smoke from the hearth thinned. The time of silence arrived. Oh no, the time when the subconscious wakens. For a Viking, sleep was not merely physiological rest. It was a journey. The moment your eyelids closed, your soul slipped free from the body and went walking. What it met on those walks was often more terrifying than any battle. Nightmares, nocturnal visitors, creatures that sit on your chest and refuse to let you breathe. You think that is just sleep paralysis? The Vikings knew for sure. It is her who comes, Mara. In the next chapter, we will put out the last lights and speak about why Vikings feared sleeping on their back, what it meant to see your double in a dream, and how to tell a prophetic dream from the result of overeating pea porridge. Welcome to the world of Scandinavian mysticism. The fire in the hearth had collapsed into a narrow red line of embers. The shadows that had danced on the walls froze and merged into one solid black. You lie beneath your hide, listening to the breathing of the household, trying to fall asleep. For a person of the Viking age, Closing their eyes was not merely switching off consciousness. It was taking a risk. The moment your body stilled, your soul, the hugr, packed its things and set off on a walk. Modern folk believe dreams are only the brain's sorting of information. A Viking knew otherwise. A dream is a second reality, and far more dangerous than the first. Your soul can slip out through your mouth, which is why sleeping with an open mouth was not only unbecoming, but reckless. A fly might fly in, and the soul would be unable to leave to travel the worlds. It might visit relatives, spy on enemies, or meet those better left unseen. And then you sleep. You are warm, and suddenly you feel a weight. At first it is light, like a cat settling on your legs. Then it grows heavier. The pressure crawls up your chest. You try to inhale but cannot. Your ribs feel banded with an iron hoop. You want to scream, to call for your father or brother sleeping beside you, but no sound escapes. You are paralyzed, and the weight on your chest takes shape, and you know who it is. It is Mara. The very word nightmare in many European tongues, the English word nightmare, the French term for the same, the Scandinavian Mararit, comes from the name of this being. Mara is not simply a bad dream. She is a concrete, supernatural entity, a woman spirit who comes at night to, shall we say, sit upon the sleeper. In the sagas, Mara is described as a real danger. She can press a man until he is utterly spent. People believed Mara could enter a house through the smallest crack, through a keyhole, through the smoke hole, even through a hole in the wall. There is a famous story in the saga of the Inglings about Kanung in Anland. He fell asleep and suddenly cried out that Mara trod upon him. His men flung themselves to restrain her at his feet, but Mara shifted to his head and squeezed so fiercely that Kanung, let us say, finished his reign prematurely and went to the halls of his ancestors. So if your benchmate began moaning and thrashing in sleep, they were roused at once. But this had to be done with the utmost delicacy. "Thorstein, wake up!" the wife whispers, gently shaking her husband's shoulder. "What? Where is my sword? Quiet! Mara sat on you." You wheezed like an old bellows. Why should one not startle a sleeper? Remember the hugr. The soul wanders. If you give the sleeper a kick or shout loudly in his ear, the soul might not return in time. The result? The man wakes, but not whole. He becomes mad, loses his memory, or falls ill with a sickness of the mind. A harsh awakening was regarded as an act of aggression, almost an attempt on health. Waking the king, in fact, was only permitted if the house burned on all four sides. In all other cases, the servants moved on tiptoe and waited for His Majesty to deign to come back from the astral plane on his own. But Mara is only half the trouble. There were guests far worse. Imagine a night, silence, the wind the only sound. Then you hear steps, heavy, dragging steps across the roof. Something enormous walks right above your head, and the beams creak in complaint. Or, worse still, that something begins to knock on the door. These are Draugr. Draugr are the wandering ancestors of Scandinavian folklore. Forget modern zombies who simply want to eat. A Draugr is a person, an individual with will and malice of its own. He was a man who was, let us say, not very pleasant in life, greedy, cruel, quarrelsome, and after his earthly course had ended, he refused to lie still. Draugr were not disembodied ghosts. Oh no, they were terrifyingly material.
They possessed monstrous physical strength, could grow in size and weigh as much as 3 bears. Their skin was blue-black or unnaturally pale. What did they do? They indulged in mischief on a catastrophic scale. A draugr could climb onto a roof and ride it, tearing the rafters apart. He might attack the livestock. He might lie in wait for a man who had stepped outside to answer nature's call and wrestle with him. The loser in that contest usually went to the barrow to follow the winner. The fear of draugr was so great that the Norse invented an elaborate system of precautions.
When a man suspected of a rotten character was sent on his last journey, they bound his legs or slipped sharp stones into his shoes so that it would be uncomfortable to walk. The most radical method was to carry the departed out not through the door, but through a breach in the wall, which was then immediately sealed up. The logic was ironclad. The draugr would want to return by the same way he left, but that way no longer existed. He would not find the door because he had not left by it. Brilliant, without question. And yet, if a draugr came anyway, he could be dealt with. The sagas contain epic scenes in which heroes summon draugr to judgment. Picture it. A ghost terrorizes a homestead. What do the people do? They do not call hunters of apparitions. They convene a door court. The legal procedure was held right at the threshold. Judges were appointed, witnesses were called, and the draugr was formally accused of unlawful intrusion, damage to property, and disturbing the peace. "I accuse you, Thordolf, of walking here without permission and frightening the sheep. I sentence you to eternal exile," they would intone. And the most astonishing thing was that it worked. Scandinavian spirits were, of all things, very law-abiding. If the verdict was pronounced according to the rules, the draugr sighed and went back to his barrow. A Viking could be unafraid of the sword, but he dreaded losing a legal case, even from the other side of death. Not all dreams were nightmares. Viking women treated prophetic dreams with reverence. The draumar were taken as encrypted messages of fate. Women were regarded as the best interpreters. If Kon dreamed that his hair turned into golden ears of grain, that portended a rich harvest. If he dreamed that he stripped off his clothing, it meant loss of honor or the ending of his journey. The most common theme in prophetic dreams was animals. Enemies as wolves, traitors as foxes, friends as bears. This was called fylgja, the guardian spirit that every person had, and which often took the form of an animal. "I dreamed that a pack of gray wolves surrounded our house," the Jarl says in the morning, frowning into his cup of ale. "Then do not go to the thing today without your mail shirt," his wife replies calmly, handing him bread. They lived in a world of signs. A beam creaked. The house spirit was displeased. A shield fell from the wall. Expect guests. An itch at the nose meant news or a quarrel. Luck decided which it would be. At night, these signs grew especially vivid. How did they protect themselves in sleep? Magic was as much a part of daily life as hygiene. Runes were often carved above the bed, especially the rune Nauthis for need or Algis for protection. Under the pillow, or beneath the head if no pillow was used, they placed a piece of iron, a knife, or simply an iron nail. Iron was the metal that all spirits and trolls loathed. It was believed that Mara could not sit upon a sleeper if cold iron lay under his head. Another means of protection was amulets. The most popular was Thor's hammer. Small hammers were worn around the neck by everyone, from the youngest to the oldest. Thor was the chief guardian of men against monsters.
Falling asleep, a Viking would clutch his hammer in his hand, entrusting his soul to the red-bearded thunderer. Then the night passed. Shadows grew pale. The first gray light forced its way through the smoke hole. Draugr slipped back into their barrows. Mara flew off to seek other prey. Birds waked, cows lowed. One by one, the household opened their eyes, checked that the soul was still in place, felt their beards to see whether jokers had taken a shearing. All was in order. Another night had been survived, but ahead lay a long winter day and an even longer evening. In northern lands, twilight comes early. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the light is already gone. People went to bed early. You cannot work in the dark.
What to do? Sitting in the darkened silence is dull. The Vikings found a way to turn those endless hours of dusk into the most absorbing pastime. They built a culture that gave us some of the finest stories in the world. While the women finished their tasks and the men mended the nets, a figure would rise in the middle of the hall. A skald, or simply an old man who remembered everything. Thus began the time of the sagas, the hours when words wove reality more deftly than any loom. What did those hardened warriors do when they could not swing a sword? What games did they play? And how were whole kingdoms lost over a board? We will speak of that intellectual and gamblesome leisure in the next chapter. A long northern evening is a trial for the mind. The sun sets after lunch, and the world sinks into inky dark for about 16 hours. If you simply went to bed at 5 o'clock in the evening, you would wake at 2 in the night and lie staring at the ceiling, waiting for the visit of that very Mara we spoke of in the previous chapter. Therefore, the time between supper and final sleep was sacred. It was the time of the evening vigil. Forget the stereotype of Vikings as dull, brawling oafs who only know how to roar and heft a shield. In those evening hours, the Longhouse became a literary salon, a chess club, and a workshop all at once. The IQ of that smoke-filled room soared. The chief entertainment, of course, was the Iron Age television. The skald. A skald was not merely a poet or singer. He was a walking library, an encyclopedia, and a news channel rolled into one. In an age when books cost the price of a small kingdom and few could read, whole histories, laws, and gossip were stored in the heads of these people. Picture a man rising at the hearth in the center of the hall. He did not read from a sheet. He closed his eyes and began to recite. These were not folk tales in the easy sense. This was mathematically calibrated poetry.
Norse verse is perhaps the most intricate form of poetry in human history. There were such strict rules of rhyme, alliteration, and inner rhythm that composing even a quatrain was a feat. Skalds memorized thousands of lines. They used kennings, poetic metaphors, and riddles. A skald would never simply say, ship. He would say, horse of the sea. He would not say, gold. He would say, fire of the water. He would not say, sword. He would say, battlefish. Grandfather, why did the battlefish bite the linden of the sword's ringing? A child whispered. Because the warrior was careless, my son. Listen on, the elder answered. Listeners had to solve these riddles on the fly. It was exercise for the mind. If you did not understand the kennings, you were a laughingstock. Sitting through the performance of a saga and blinking like an idiot was a mark of uncultured taste. The Vikings were snobbish in their own way. They prized a beautiful turn of phrase as much as a keen blade. But what were these stories about? Oh, they were the best blockbusters of their day. Sagas were a mixture of historical chronicle, legal record, and mystical thriller.
There were family dramas in which husband and wife divided property with the testimony of 50 witnesses and 2 sorcerers. There were voyages to distant lands where people had blue skin or where dwarfs lived. There were encounters with gods who behaved suspiciously human, grasping, cheating, getting into absurd scrapes. Sagas fulfilled a vital social function. They were a board of honor and a board of shame. Everyone dreamed of appearing in a saga. If a song was sung of you, became immortal. Your body would rot in the barrow, but your name would be spoken 300 years hence. There was a darker side, though. Skalds could compose a nid, a scathing, accursing poem. A nid was a fearsome weapon. It was believed that if the skald recited the proper nid, a man might lose his hair, his sword might break, or his wife could run away. For composing a nid, one could be driven from the country, for it was tantamount to a magical attack. Thus people tried to befriend the skalds and feed them generously. While the skalds sang, the hands of the household knew no rest. Idleness was a sin. Women spun wool and wove on upright looms. The steady tap of Aniti's stone weights set a hypnotic evening rhythm, and sails were stitched by lamplight. Men carved wood, mended harnesses, and braided nets. It was on those evenings that the incredible carved dragon heads that crowned the ships came into being. A Viking might spend 200 hours carving an intricate pattern into a plain porridge spoon. Why? Because beauty was a way to bargain with the chaos of the world. If an object was beautiful, it worked better and lasted longer. Not everyone worked. In the corner, away from the bustle, 2 men bent over a board. They were playing Nefatafel. Forget chess. Chess came later. Nefatafel is a game that perfectly reflects the Viking mind. In chess, the forces are balanced, white against black, equal numbers of pieces. In Nefatafel, there is no equality. The game is asymmetric. In the center of the board stands the king and his small retinue. They are surrounded by enemies outnumbering them 2 to 1. The king's task is to escape, to reach a corner of the board. The enemy's task is to encircle the king and prevent his flight. This is no mere pastime. It is a tactical simulator of a raid. Vikings often found themselves outnumbered on hostile ground. They needed to break through to the ships and withdraw. Or, conversely, they might surround an enemy's fortified hall. Nefatafel taught unconventional thinking, the willingness to sacrifice the small to save the essential, and how to act under the pressure of an enemy's numerical superiority. "I have your Jarl trapped, Ragnar. He has nowhere to go," one player said. "Is that what you think? What if I sacrifice these 2 guards? Look, the way north is clear," replied the other. The excitement was fierce. They played for stakes, for goods, for rings and bracelets. Sometimes, in a flush of passion, a player would put his freedom on the line, or someone else's. To lose at Nefatafel was a sting, but an honorable lesson. It meant that Odin was not on your side that day, and your mind needed sharpening. Riddles were another obsession. A love of riddles runs through all of Scandinavian mythology. Odin himself, to test the wit of the giant Vafthrudnir, engaged him in a riddle contest. The one who failed paid the highest price. In the Longhouse, the wagers were smaller, but the tension just as sharp. Who walks over the bridge but casts no shadow? Wind. Who has one eye but sees more than 2 sighted men? Odin. The ability to solve a metaphor quickly and elegantly was valued above brute strength. Wittiness was social mobility. You could be poor, but if you spoke cleverly and amusingly, you were brought to the table with the Jarl. Children received special attention. Viking children did not sleep in separate rooms from 7 in the evening. They sat right there by the fire, listening to sagas of heroes who bested trolls, watching fathers play Hnefatafl, and absorbing their culture. They had toys, wooden swords, small boats, rag dolls, but the best schooling was practical. A boy at 5 years old already received his first real knife. Not a toy, but a sharp iron blade. "Careful, don't cut yourself," a modern mother might say. "If you cut yourself, don't cry. Remember how to hold the handle," a Viking mother would say. Scars on the fingers were part of growing up. Children were taught to be self-reliant and tough from the cradle. Evening gatherings were a school of life. There they learned who their enemies were, who their friends were, and to whom the clan owed the debt of honor. A family feud was inherited, as were silver and the right way to run a household. Gradually the fire burned lower. The skald fell silent at the most intriguing moment. "And what happened to the hero next? You'll learn tomorrow, if you catch enough fish," he warned. Players swept pieces from the board. Craftsmen put away their tools. The longhouse sank into sleep. But that cozy, smoky, intellectual evening was only one side of the coin. Vikings loved their home, but they loved leaving it even more. A true Viking could not sit by the hearth forever. As soon as the snow melted and the sea freed itself from ice, a dangerous light kindled in their eyes. The call of the road. To sleep on a soft hide beneath the roof beside your wife, that is good. But to sleep beneath the open sky, covered by a shield, when above you there are only stars, and beneath you is another man's land that you intend to conquer, that is a wholly different thing. In the next chapter we will pack a campaign kit, say farewell to the comforts of the longhouse, and walk out where there are no walls. We will learn how to pitch a camp in 5 minutes, why 2 Vikings under one cloak make the best heating system, and what it is like to sleep when you are hunter and prey at once. It is time to go outside. The longhouse door slams behind you, cutting off the noise, the warmth, and the smell of 50 relatives. You breathe deep. The air beyond the threshold rings with the clean shock of frost. There is no time to luxuriate in oxygen. You are on campaign. And for a Viking, a campaign is not a romantic ramble with a pack. It is hard labor, moving goods, men, and ambitions from point A to point B, where the B points are usually not delighted to see you. The first rule of Scandinavian camping: comfort is not luxury. It is a means of survival. If you do not sleep, you cannot row. If you cannot row, you will not reach England. And if you will not reach England, why have you gotten up from the couch at all? Therefore, the Vikings, contrary to stereotypes about Spartan living, tried to surround themselves with as much coziness as the open field allowed. Look at the wagons the horses drag. They do not carry only swords and provisions, dried cod. They carry taken-apart houses. The Viking tent is an engineering wonder. Forget modern nylon tents that go up in 2 minutes and blow away on the first serious gust. The Northerner's tent is a monumental structure. The best-known finds from Gokstad and Oseberg show constructions on heavy wooden frames. Imagine the letter A carved from oak, joined by a crossbar. A heavy wool fabric, often doubled and soaked in fat for waterproofing, was stretched over that frame. Inside such a tent, one could stand at full height. There was no central pole to be in everyone's way. The interior felt as roomy as a small chamber. Wealthy earls, chieftains, hauled true folding beds with them. Yes, you heard that right. Ragnar Lothbrok, or his historical prototype, did not sleep on the damp ground if he could help it. He slept on a mattress lifted above the earth inside a tent trimmed with tapestries and hangings. Why go to such trouble? Because the earth is cold. The earth pulls life away. To sleep on the ground in Scandinavia is a guaranteed route to pneumonia and rheumatism before you are 25. Therefore, any self-respecting leader brought a bed with him. "Jarl, we have stopped for only one night. Maybe we should not set up your bed?" a tired warrior asks timidly. "Set it up," the Jarl answers calmly, stretching his shoulders. "Tomorrow is battle. I must dream of victory, not have my back feel rooted to the ground." But what of the ordinary warriors who had no personal litter-bearers? They used simpler tents or slept in the open. Here, the harsh arithmetic of warmth came into play. A lone man in a winter wood is most likely a frozen man. So they slept in groups. 2 or 3 men lay pressed tight together, wrapped in one large common cloak or in sewn-together skins. This was called being in fellowship. The word we translate as companionship or partnership literally means the pooling of property. But on campaign, it also signified the pooling of heat. Sleeping cuddled up to a bearded comrade who is not washed for a week may be questionable aesthetically, but it is the only correct choice by the laws of thermodynamics. You warm your friend's back. He warms your chest. You breathe into one air pocket under the cloak. "Hrolf, your beard tickles my nose." "Bear it, Bjorn. At least my feet warm yours." Sleep. In moments like that, the fighting brotherhood is born. You trust this man not only to stand behind you with his shield in battle, but not to pull the blanket off you at night. That is the highest form of trust. Clothing was never taken off on campaign. Where sleeping naked in the longhouse was an ordinary thing, doing so in the woods would have been madness. You slept in woolen trousers, a tunic, a cloak, a cap, and sometimes even with your boots on. Why? Because alarm can sound at any second. They called it the sleep of the hare, one eye closed, the other watching the forest. The ears were tuned to the snap of a twig. If wolves or enemies attacked the camp, you would not have time to hunt for pants. You had to bolt up, grab an axe, and meet danger face to face, not in your underwear. Boots were slipped off only to dry and to replace the grass inside them. Yes, instead of socks, Vikings often stuffed dry sedge or hay into their boots. It is an excellent insulator and soaks up moisture. At evening by the fire, you could see a little scene. Hardened world conquerors sitting and solemnly picking at hay, shaking it out of their boots. The cleverest invention for sleep on the march was the hutfat, a leather sleeping bag. Imagine a huge sack of oiled bull hide. By day it held gear, clothes, and rations. At night, the contents were shaken out and people climbed inside, often 2 to a hide. The leather kept ground damp from seeping in and shielded from rain above. If you tied the neck shut, inside it became hot and humid like a steam bath. But the hutfat had a serious drawback. If the camp were attacked, getting out of that oily cocoon was no simple task. Picture the night, the cry to arms, and you and your comrade tangled in oiled leather like 2 worms. Many brave fighters were put out of action, not because they fought poorly, but because they failed to get out of their sleeping bag in time. For that reason, in dangerous regions, the bag was left unfastened, or people slept on top of it. Food on campaign differed from home fare. No hot porridge in the morning if you could not risk making a fire. And fire means smoke, which can be seen for miles. The dry ration of a Viking was jerky, cheese as hard as stone, and flatbreads dried until they were like tiles. They had to be soaked for a long time in water or ale, or you would break a tooth. The most curious March dish was the skin stew. No, not in the sense of a nightclub. If you managed to take game or butcher a sheep, the meat was not boiled in a cauldron. Hauling a huge iron pot on a foot march is a burden, so they used the animal's own hide. The pelt was hung on stakes, water poured inside with the meat, and then red-hot stones were thrown in from the fire. The water boiled, the meat cooked. It was an ancient trick that fed a band without heavy cookware. They say the taste carried a faint aroma of burnt wool, but hunger is the best seasoning. Hygiene on campaign was almost non-existent. Forget the Saturday bath with birch branches. On the march, you only washed when you fell into a river while crossing. The grime on the face mixed with the grease rubbed on to fight windburn, and with soot. By the end of a fortnight on the road, a Viking looked and smelled in such a way that enemies fled not from fear of his strength, but from his appearance and odor. Yet even in those conditions, they found time for a small ritual of care. The comb was ever at hand.
You might be dirty, but you would never be unkempt. Morning in camp began not with exercises, but with a communal combing of beards. It helped wake people, put thoughts in order, and made a man feel civilized amid the wildwood. Night watches were another story. To sleep knowing that Sven, who lost his cloak to you at dice last night, had your life on his shoulders, is a test for the nervous system. The sentries changed every 3 to 4 hours. Time was reckoned by the stars. The most feared hour was the hour of the wolf, the pre-dawn twilight between 3 and 5 o'clock in the morning. It was believed that sleep was deepest then. The soul wandered farthest, and the boundaries between worlds thinned. It was in the hour of the wolf that attacks most often came, and it was in that hour that men most often went to their ancestors in their beds, from age or from wounds. The watchmen at that time battled not only the urge to sleep, but a primeval terror. Every stump looked like a troll, every bush a creeping foe. Did you hear something? Quiet. Daniel Hayes, Lectures Under the Moon. It's just the wind in the pines, but to me it seemed like the whisper of the Norns. The psychological strain on campaign was enormous. You were on foreign ground. You were both aggressor and prey. The people whose houses you intended to visit knew the forest better than you did. So the sleep of a Viking on campaign was the sleep of a predator, vigilant, broken, ready to explode into action. They could fall asleep in fragments, 20 minutes in the daytime at a halt, an hour in the evening, 3 in the morning. That skill of shutting down instantly and snapping awake instantly was one of the secrets of their military effectiveness. Everything changed when the landscape changed. Overland marches were hard. Feet wore out, shoulders ached from the load. But the Vikings were not called people of the fjords for nothing. Their element was water. When a band reached the shore and saw its ships, faces brightened. Drakkar, a house on the water. You might think it would be easier there. After all, you no longer had to march. But, my friends, if you believe that sleeping in a tent in the forest is extreme, try falling asleep in an open wooden boat in the middle of the North Atlantic, without a dry stitch on you, waves sloshing over the gunwale, and a sun behaving in wholly unreasonable ways. We are approaching a theme that bends the modern mind. Circadian rhythms, the biological clock. How do you sleep when the sun does not set at all, or when it refuses to rise for months? How does your body know when it needs rest if the sky is always pale? In the next chapter, we will climb aboard, hoist a sail, and head into the zone of polar madness. We will learn how the Vikings fought insomnia during the White Nights,
and how they did not sink into despair in the endless winter darkness. Prepare your eye masks. It will be very bright. Imagine a June voyage. You have just finished your watch at the oars. Your hands hum, your back aches, and you only dream of falling into the leather sack and sleeping. You crawl into your skin bag, close your eyes, and realize you are staring into a 1,000,000,000-watt spotlight. This is the midnight sun. At high latitudes in summer, the sun does not set below the horizon. It simply traces a circle across the sky, barely kissing the waterline and climbing again. At 3 in the morning, it is as bright outside as at noon. Birds sing around the clock, gulls shriek, and the waves glitter. When the body does not receive the usual signal to turn in, it begins to suspect something is wrong and slowly loses its sense of time. "Bjorn, why are you not sleeping? Your watch ended 3 hours ago." "I cannot close my eyes. This sun burns through my eyelids. It just shines, Sven. It stares at me. And by Odin's beard, it grins." Insomnia in summer was a professional ailment among Vikings. They lived in a state of constant light jet lag. How did they cope? Thick eye masks. A scrap of woolen cloth folded into quarters was the only salvation. On ships, they tried to fashion shade by hoisting extra sails or skins, but out on the open sea, light bounces off the waves and finds its way everywhere. Yet this sunny madness had another side: energy. Surplus light produced a peculiar exhilaration. In summer, the Vikings could sleep 4 hours a day and still feel full of strength. They rode for days, fought, feasted, and raised houses. It was a season of unstoppable activity. It seemed as if nature itself injected them with vigor intravenously. "We will sleep in winter." That was not merely a slogan, it was a survival strategy. We have braved the smoky longhouse, the cramped cupboard, the cold tent, and the wet deck. It seems nothing worse could follow. But Scandinavian nature had one last, most cunning trial in store for its children: a trial of light. If you live in the temperate belt, you are used to long days in summer and short days in winter. In northern Norway or Iceland, those concepts lose their meaning. There are 2 states there: a sun that refuses to go away, and come. We will meet both. Daniel Hayes, Lectures Under the Moon. Summer is a sprint. You must plant and reap, go raiding, mend the roof, stack hay, dry the fish. The sun will not let you stop. People turn into machines for processing whatever the season throws at them. Then October comes, and the world flips. The dark arrives. The sun appears over the horizon less and less. In some districts, in December, it does not rise at all. Dawn slides into dusk somewhere near noon. The rest of the day is twilight and a heavy, deep night. How does that affect sleep? Radically. Modern scientists call it seasonal affective disorder, depression. The Vikings called it the weight of winter. People grew sluggish, silent, sleepy. There is a theory of Viking hibernation. Of course, they did not enter true torpor like bears. They did not suck their paws in a den, but their rhythm slowed to an extreme. In winter, they did not sleep 8 hours, but 12, even 14. They went to bed immediately after supper, as soon as the hearth guttered, around 7 or 8 in the evening. They rose late, when it finally began to gray outside, around 9 or 10 in the morning. Life compressed itself to the patch of light by the fire. The outer world ceased to exist. Snowdrifts could bury a house to the eaves, turning it into a burrow. In that time, sleep became the chief entertainment and the chief medicine. Why the long face, Ragnar? I saw the sun last a month ago. I have forgotten what it looks like. Drink your ale and sleep. In a dream, at least, it is always summer, and you do not have to burn oil to see light. Long sleep has side effects. A broken feeling. If you sleep too much, the body rebels. The head grows heavy. The muscles slacken. To fight the winter gloom, the Scandinavians staged feasts. Yule was the midwinter festival. It was an attempt to break the dark. They lit huge bonfires, drank the strongest beer, offered sacrifices to the gods, begging for the return of the sun. Yule was life's rebellion against the endless night. Light shaped strategy. Nobody fought in winter. It was physically impossible and logistically insane. In the dark, you lose landmarks. You cannot navigate at sea. Stars are often hidden by clouds. Winter was a time of cold peace. Even the bitterest enemies stayed at home and waited for spring. That rhythm is notable. For half the year, you are a furious raider, sleeping in snatches beneath a blazing, never-setting sun. For half the year, you are a homebody, sleeping curled with your wife and listening to tales by the fire. That bipolarity made character. A Viking could be explosive and swift, and also possess endless patience. He could wait for wind, wait for prey, wait for the sun. There was, however, one thing that frightened them more than the dark: the northern lights. For us, it is a pretty picture for social media. For someone living across centuries, the dancing lights were sinister. Some believed the glow came from the armor of the Valkyries as they carried off the fallen. That was acceptable. Others, like the Sami, neighbors of the Norse, thought the lights were the souls of ancestors playing a heavenly ball with a walrus bone. If you whistled or made noise, the lights would descend and take you away, or worse, drag you forever into the icy void. So when the sky shimmered green and violet, children were herded inside. The openings that passed smoke were covered with hides, and everyone tried to be quieter than water under grass. To sleep outdoors beneath the aurora was madness. "Do not you dare lift your eyes," a mother whispers in terror, drawing the edge of a wool cloak over the child's face. "If the sky spirits catch your gaze, they will take it as an invitation." Yet the cycle is inevitable. After the endless dark comes spring. The first true warm sunbeam was greeted like the return of a beloved king from a campaign. People stepped out of their smoky houses, squinted, cried with joy, and held their pale faces to the light. With warmth came anxiety as well. The sea shed its icy shackles, and the world began to move again. That meant that soon the horizon would be scored by foreign masts, or your own sails would catch a wind that carried the longship toward new shores. But this time, the wind of change brought something different. And here we come to the finishing line. It is not about one hero departing for Valhalla, but about the setting of an entire age. The Vikings lived to the rhythm of nature. The sun rose, we rose. The sun set, we lit the hearth. Their alarm was the cry of the gull or the bellow of hungry stock. Yet from the south, a force was advancing that was stronger than any storm. It carried not only a new god, but also a discipline never seen before. Very soon, this world, where time was measured by the tides and by the length of a shadow, will hear a sound that will break the ancient magic of sleep. A sound louder than Thor's thunder. The ringing of the church bell. In the concluding chapter to come, we will learn how civilization overcame the wild northern comfort. We will see how warm, smoky turf houses were replaced by cold stone castles,
and how an easy, flexible schedule gave way to a rigid timetable of prayers. Prepare yourselves. The Viking Age is ending, and we will have to wake up in a very different world. The world of the first alarm clock. Do you hear that sound? It is nothing like the roar of a storm, the crack of a burning log, or the howl of a wolf. It is a clear, rhythmic, metallic strike that travels across the fjord, bounces off the cliffs, and penetrates even the thickest sheepskin. Bam! Bam! The church bell rings. That ringing became the farewell hymn of the Viking Age. We are used to saying that the Viking era ended in the year 106, when the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada met his fate at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But in truth, it did not end on the battlefield. It ended in the bedroom. In that very moment, when the free man of the North first woke up, not because the sun had risen, but because he was ordered to. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia with more than the cross and the sword. It arrived with clocks. For a Viking, time had been circular, the year a wheel, the day a small circle. Everything repeated. The new faith introduced the idea of linear time. Time runs out. Time is a resource granted by God, and spending it on sleep is a sin. The notion of canonical hours appeared. The monks who first brought the new faith, often risking their lives, lived by a strict regimen. Matins, prime, terce. One had to pray even through the night.
Imagine the shock of Bjorn, who was used to sleeping up to 14 hours in a winter day, storing fat and strength. "Rise, my son. It is time to praise the Lord," the missionary says cheerfully, shaking the Viking by the shoulder at 4 in the morning. "But it's still dark," Bjorn moans. Even the trolls are still asleep. The Lord does not sleep, and he commands you not to. Idleness is the mother of all vices. Hibernation, which for centuries had been the key to survival in a harsh climate, was suddenly declared slothful, one of the grievous sins. To lie by the hearth and stare into embers became morally suspect. One was now supposed to be productive all year round. Along with the new schedule came a new fashion in housing, and it was a catastrophe for Scandinavian coziness. The longhouse, squat, smoke-darkened, but an astonishingly warm thermos of turf and timber, began to fall out of favor. The nobility wanted to live like they had seen in Europe, and in Europe they lived in stone. Stone is a prestigious, eternal, and icy material. Stone walls in the climate of Norway or Sweden are a refrigerator. To heat a vaulted stone hall with an open hearth is impossible. The Vikings exchanged their snug burrows for majestic but horribly chilly castles and towers. Chimneys appeared. Progress, one might say. Smoke no longer ate at the eyes, but with the smoke went the heat, up the flue and out of the house. In the longhouse, the thermal blanket remained under the roof. In the new house, with its fireplace, warmth existed only within a radius of about 1 meter from the fire. "Your new house is magnificent, Jarl," the guest says, tapping. "Such high ceilings?" "Yes," replies the Jarl, wrapping himself in 3 fur cloaks. "It invigorates," he thinks, "yet it is like living as the king of the Franks. And kings do not freeze. They shiver magnificently." Sleeping in such a house became an ordeal. It was in this very era that the closed beds and cupboards we mentioned earlier, those wooden boxes, became commonplace. People crawled into those coffers not for privacy so much as to keep from freezing in their own fine houses. Attitudes toward the body changed along with the furniture. Remember our Saturday baths? The cleanliness the Vikings took pride in? The church looked upon that with a scowl. Public nakedness, men and women washing together, whipping one another with birch switches. It all smelled of debauchery and paganism. Bathhouses were shut. Regular washings came to be seen as excess, an indulgent attention to mortal flesh. The linen shift, changed often, gave way to a coarse hair shirt, prickly garments meant to discipline the spirit. The scent of cleanliness was replaced by the scent of holiness, which, regrettably, suspiciously resembled the smell of unwashed bodies. The paradox was cruel. Civilization made the Vikings dirtier than they had been in their so-called barbaric past. But the cruelest blow fell upon dreaming. Once sleep was a portal. A man lay down knowing his soul might set off on a journey, meet ancestors, or receive counsel from Freya. Dreams were interpreted. The dream world was believed. The new faith said, "Stop! Dreams are either nonsense or temptation from the deceiver. To believe in them is superstition. To speak with your forebears in sleep is forbidden sorcery. Your soul must not wander. It must lie still in the body and await the final judgment." The realm of dreams was declared off-limits. Magic withdrew. Only physiology remained. And so we stand on the threshold of the medieval age. Our hero, a descendant of great seafarers, is no longer a Viking. He is a good Christian and a subject of the king. He rises to the bell, not to the cock's cry. He lives in a cold house because that is fashionable. He bathes less in order to spare his soul. He fears his dreams. Longships were hauled ashore and rotted in the rains. Swords were reforged into plowshares, or else redone into arms for the king's army. Boisterous boasts and oath-making gave way to decorous banquets, where one extra cup of ale might draw the priest's rebuke. An era came to its end. But did it vanish without a trace? Look at us now. We too live by a bell, a smartphone's chime. We sit in offices cooled by air conditioning that throws the same cold drafts you would feel in a stone hall. We drink coffee to tame our natural rhythms. We dry our hair with electric devices and oil our beards. Hipsters, hello. Somewhere deep inside each of us, beneath layers of office dress codes, endless deadlines, and mortgage obligations, that old Viking still sleeps. He wakes when we go into the open and light a fire. He wakes when, defying diets, we fall upon roasted meat. He wakes when we wrap ourselves head to toe in a blanket and hide from the world in our own private leather sack. He certainly wakes when, on a Friday evening, we raise a glass and say, "To us." The history of everyday life is not the history of things, but the history of how we tried to make existence a little less unbearable and a little warmer. The Vikings were masters of that art. They learned to sleep through storms, to love in crowds, and to find flavor in bland porridge. They are gone, but their night remains with us. Dark and starry, full of rustle and the smell of smoke. So, when you switch off your computer, put your phone away and extinguish the light, listen. Perhaps in the wind beyond the window, you will hear the creak of a longship's mast. Or perhaps the cat that leaps up onto your chest is not entirely a cat, but a small, comforting mare, come to remind you that the borders between worlds are still open. Sleep hard, and may your dreams be worthy of a saga. Yeah. With you was Daniel Hayes. See you in the next episode of Lectures Under the Moon. Please subscribe and like. Thanks for watching. I'm Daniel Hayes. See you next time on Lectures Under the Moon.